The story begins in a stretch of American woodland so quiet it feels as if the trees are holding their breath. The locals say the forest has a memory, one that never forgets, and never forgives, and that anyone who stays long enough begins to sense the weight of something buried beneath its roots. When the first autumn winds crawled through the valley, a lone hiker stepped off the marked trail and found a path that shouldn't have been there. It wound deep into the undergrowth, too narrow for human footsteps, as if carved by the forest itself. At the end of that path, half swallowed by vines and rotting timber, stood a cabin that looked older than the town nearby, older than the state lines drawn around it. The hiker swore later that the cabin wasn't abandoned, no matter how broken it seemed. There were fresh footprints in the mud. A window curtain that moved when no wind blew. But the thing that froze him was hanging on the wall inside, a yellowed marriage certificate, cracked with age, naming a man whose grave still lies in the local cemetery and a woman no one has ever admitted to knowing. Their signatures wavered across the paper as if written by hands that trembled, or resisted, or were forced. And under the date, in faded pen strokes, someone had added a warning so faint it could barely be read: never speak their vows again. The hiker fled, but the story did not. When he told the sheriff what he found, the old man's face drained of color. He only said one thing: the cabin burned down 50 years ago, and the marriage recorded there was never meant to be remembered. Yet the certificate exists. The names exist. And the forest, some say, still whispers about the night when a man made the most unthinkable vow in American history, a vow that cost more than one life and birthed a truth the woods still hide in their shadows. Whatever happened in that cabin was not just a marriage. It was a crossing of lines that should never be crossed, a union that still stains the soil, and a mystery that refuses to stay dead. Centers on the moment a hiker stumbles upon an abandoned cabin hidden so deeply in the American woods that it almost feels like the trees have been guarding it for decades. This discovery is not ordinary, it's the kind of moment that shifts the air, makes the forest seem suddenly aware, and leaves the visitor with a sense that he has walked into a place he was never meant to find. The hiker had not planned to venture off the trail that morning, but something about the silence around him felt unusual, as if the forest itself was nudging him forward. When he noticed a faint, narrow path leading away from the main route, curiosity pulled him toward it. The path looked wrong, too clean in some places, too overgrown in others, as though it appeared only when it chose to, guiding those who dared to follow. Branches seemed to arch overhead in unnatural shapes, dimming the sunlight and creating a tunnel of shadows that swallowed his steps. The deeper he walked, the more he felt a pressure building in his chest. The usual forest sounds had vanished. No birds. No rustling leaves. Only an eerie, heavy quiet that seemed to listen to him. After what felt like far longer than it should have taken to travel such a short stretch, he saw it, a small, decaying structure camouflaged by vines, moss, and thyme. The cabin leaned crookedly, as if trying to hide behind the trees. Its wood was dark with age, the roof sagging under the weight of neglect, yet there was something strangely intact about it, as though someone had cared for it not too long ago. A single window remained unbroken, but what unsettled him most was the feeling that someone had just been there. Fresh footprints marked the damp earth, but they didn't resemble normal shoe prints, they were smudged, dragged, as if made by someone unsteady or unwilling. Stepping inside, the air smelled like damp soil and old smoke. Dust floated in narrow beams of light that cut through gaps in the walls. What should have been a forgotten, empty room instead held signs of a life interrupted: a chair overturned, a lantern half filled with oil, and a wooden table scarred with deep, deliberate marks. But the object that drew him closer, almost against his will, was hanging crookedly on the far wall. It was a yellowed piece of paper framed in cracked glass, a marriage certificate dated long before the cabin should have ceased to exist. The names written on it felt familiar yet impossible. The hiker felt a prickle at the back of his neck, sensing the weight of the forest pressing in behind him, as if waiting for his reaction, as if guarding the truth he had just uncovered. Revolves around the unsettling discovery that the groom named on the marriage certificate was a real man whose existence is confirmed through old town records, burial documents, and faded census pages, yet the bride whose name is written in the same trembling ink appears to have never existed at all. When news of the certificate reaches the small-town historical office, an archivist reluctantly agrees to help verify the names, though her expression tightens the moment she hears the bride's name spoken aloud. She retrieves dusty boxes of local registries, their pages brittle from age, and begins cross-checking every record from the late 19th century through the early decades of the 20th. The groom's name appears just as expected: birth records, land ownership logs, church attendance notes, and finally a grave marker documented in the cemetery ledger. All of it paints the picture of a man who lived a modest but traceable life. But the bride's name, despite its bold presence on the certificate, leads nowhere. The archivist searches marriage licenses, birth records, tax filings, and handwritten lists kept by midwives and traveling census workers. She even checks school rosters, church rolls, and newspaper announcements, but the bride's identity is absent from every possible source. Each query ends in a dead end, as though someone intentionally erased every trace of her existence. The few elders still living in the town claim they have never heard the name before. Some avoid the question altogether, their eyes darting to the window or the floor, their voices turning thin. Others respond with vague phrases: "Some people shouldn't be remembered," or "that wasn't her real name anyway," but refuse to elaborate. The deeper the search goes, the more the archivist's confidence wavers. She begins to wonder how a marriage certificate could contain the name of a person who seems to have been removed from time itself. The strangest detail surfaces when examining the certificate more closely. Underneath the bride's name, faint impressions of erased letters can be seen, as though a different name had once been written there and then scraped away. It's impossible to tell who made the change or why. Even the ink used for the bride's signature differs slightly in texture, as though written with a trembling hand or perhaps by someone unfamiliar with writing their own name. The groom's signature is steady, practiced, but hers curves erratically across the line, the strokes uneven and oddly spaced. Some letters dip too low, others rise sharply, almost like someone imitating handwriting they had seen but never learned. This discrepancy raises more unsettling questions than answers. Who was she? Why was her identity concealed? And why did the traces of her existence need to be erased so completely that even the land seems determined not to remember her? 3 focuses on the reaction of the townspeople when anyone attempts to ask about the couple, especially the mysterious bride whose existence seems to have been wiped from every official record. The moment her name is spoken aloud within the town's borders, a strange shift occurs in those who hear it. Conversations that once flowed easily turn stiff, guarded, and painfully short. People who are normally friendly and talkative suddenly find errands to rush off to, doors to lock, and windows to shut. Even the air feels different, as if the very atmosphere tightens whenever the topic is raised. Outsiders quickly learn that discussing the marriage is like pushing against an unseen wall, one built from old fear, old guilt, or both. The locals speak in half-whispers, glancing over their shoulders as though someone might be listening, someone they don't dare anger. Some of the older residents react with visible discomfort, their hands trembling slightly as they wave the questions away. They mutter that certain stories should be left alone, that memories buried this long are better kept that way. When pressed, they offer warnings instead of answers, insisting that the forest has its own rules, and those who ignore them tend not to last very long. A few go so far as to refuse eye contact altogether, staring past the questioner as though recalling something they wish they had never seen. Their faces pale at the mere mention of the cabin, and they repeat the same phrase, almost rehearsed: "Don't wander too deep. Don't stir up old vows." It is unclear whether they are protecting the past, or trying to protect anyone foolish enough to dig into it. The younger townspeople respond differently, but with the same unease. They have heard stories, fragments passed down like warnings whispered through generations. They mention strange events in the woods, lights seen between the trees at night, sounds that don't belong to any animal, and figures that vanish when approached. But even they refuse to say anything about the bride. One young man, usually outspoken, stammers when asked and claims he doesn't know anything, though his eyes betray something else entirely. Another girl insists she has never heard the name before, yet she clutches a necklace so tightly her knuckles whiten, as though holding on to something that keeps her safe. The deeper one pushes, the clearer it becomes that this silence isn't simple fear, it is collective. The whole town seems bound by an unspoken agreement, a pact forged long before any of them were born. Whatever happened between the couple, whatever truth was buried in those woods, left a mark so deep that the people still feel its echo. And the way they look toward the forest's edge suggests that the past, no matter how much they avoid it, has not finished with them yet. Centers on the unsettling rumor of a forbidden ceremony, a marriage performed at an hour when no church bell rings, long after decent people lock their doors, and under circumstances that even the oldest residents refuse to explain fully. The story surfaces only in fragments, spoken reluctantly by those who claim their grandparents or great-grandparents witnessed something strange decades ago. According to these whispered accounts, the couple did not marry in the town's small chapel as the records would normally show. Instead, the ceremony took place in the woods, deep enough that moonlight struggled to reach the ground, at a time when the sky was nearly black. They say a preacher was brought there in secrecy, a man who lived on the outskirts of town and was known for his unusual way of interpreting scripture. He was a quiet figure, respected but solitary, and it was precisely his detachment from the community that made him the perfect choice for a wedding the town wanted no part of. The reason for this secrecy remains tangled in rumor. Some believe the bride was not allowed to marry within the town because of who she was or where she came from, though no one can agree on those details. Others whisper that the groom insisted on a ceremony away from prying eyes, claiming it was for their safety, though that explanation fails to quiet the unease surrounding the event. A few insist the bride herself refused to step inside a church, saying she reacted violently to the idea, though no one can say whether this was superstition, fear, or something else entirely. What most versions agree on is this: the ceremony began just before midnight, with only the trees and the preacher as witnesses, and something about it felt wrong from the beginning. Those who claim their ancestors watched from a distance describe the forest as unusually silent that night, the wind dead still, the air heavy as though waiting for something. The preacher's voice echoed unnaturally, carrying farther than it should have, bending oddly in the cold air. The bride stood rigid beside the groom, her posture strange, her face hidden beneath a veil that seemed far too thick for such a small gathering. Some say her movements were stiff, jerky, as though she were imitating the gestures of a human bride rather than performing them naturally. And when the preacher spoke the final vow, the forest seemed to react. The trees shuddered though no wind blew, and a low hum vibrated beneath the ground, subtle but unmistakable. The most chilling detail in these accounts involves the preacher himself. Not long after the wedding, he vanished. His home was found abandoned, a pot still warm on his stove and his Bible left open on the table, pages turned to a passage about forbidden unions. No trace of him was ever recovered. Some claim he ran, others swear the forest swallowed him, but either way his disappearance became another fragment of the town's silent history. Whatever happened during that midnight ceremony, it was powerful enough that no one dared speak of it openly again. Focuses on the discovery of the church ledger, the very book that should have documented the marriage in clean, careful handwriting like every other ceremony performed in the town. Instead, what the ledger contains is a single page that has been violently altered, as though someone tried to smother the memory of the wedding with ink and desperation. The ledger is kept in a glass case inside the old chapel, a building that no longer holds regular services but still stands as a relic of the town's forgotten years. When an outsider asks to examine it, the caretaker hesitates, offering excuses about fragility and preservation, but eventually unlocks the case with trembling hands. As the book is opened, the faint smell of mildew and candle wax rises from the pages, each one filled with careful script documenting decades of baptisms, funerals, and weddings. Then comes the page that shouldn't look any different from the rest, but does. The entry for the couple is there, but only barely. Thick black ink has been slashed across the lines, as if someone took a quill and dragged it repeatedly over the names until they were nearly indecipherable. The strokes are angry, uneven, and pressed so hard that they tore into the page, leaving grooves and small holes. The surrounding entries are untouched, written neatly and calmly, creating an eerie contrast with the violence of this one single line. At first glance, the names seem erased beyond recognition, but upon closer inspection, faint shapes of letters emerge beneath the layers of ink, hauntingly similar to the ones written on the marriage certificate found in the cabin. The date is partially visible too, though someone attempted to blot it out, leaving only smeared remnants of numbers that match the time period when the forbidden ceremony was rumored to have taken place. As the outsider studies the page, the caretaker becomes visibly uneasy. His eyes avoid the ledger, lingering instead on the chapel's dark corners as though expecting something to move there. When asked who might have vandalized the record, he offers contradictory explanations, first blaming humidity, then mischief by children, then claiming he has no memory of the page ever being altered. His voice wavers, his hands tremble, and he eventually blurts out that the page wasn't always like that, though he refuses to explain further. He mentions, almost accidentally, that the previous caretakers warned him not to disturb certain entries, and that one of them insisted the ink was not meant to hide the names but to protect the living from whatever those names still carry. A deeper examination of the page reveals something even stranger. Under a specific angle of light, a faint reddish tint appears behind the black ink, as though another substance had seeped into the paper long before the vandalism occurred. Some speculate it might be old ink reacting to age, but others, quietly, fearfully, suggest it looks too much like dried blood. The torn page, the trembling caretaker, and the violent attempt to erase the marriage all point to one unsettling truth. Someone tried desperately to bury the union, yet the record refuses to stay hidden, as if the past itself resists being erased. Centers on the chilling rumors of a child connected to the couple, a child the locals speak of only in fragments, with lowered voices and eyes that dim with something between guilt and dread. No official record of this child exists. There is no birth certificate, no church note, no doctor's entry scribbled on a delivery log. But stories drift through the town like lingering smoke, shared only when night falls and the forest seems far enough away not to hear. According to those whispered accounts, the child was born sometime after the forbidden marriage, in a storm so violent it rattled the windows of every house for miles. The midwife who went to attend the birth returned home pale and trembling, locking herself inside for days and refusing to speak of what she saw. Those who lived near her at the time claimed she prayed louder that week than she had in her entire life. The locals described the child not in physical terms, but in reactions, the way adults would tense when they heard the baby cry, the way people refused to hold it, the way some mothers crossed themselves when the child was carried past. No story ever fully explains why. The details shift depending on who speaks, but all versions agree that the child was different in a way that frightened even the most resilient souls. Some say the child's eyes never seemed to focus on the people around, instead darting toward the shadows of rooms as though watching something no one else could see. Others claim the child did not cry like ordinary infants, that its wail sounded strange, too resonant, echoing unnaturally through the cabin walls. There are also murmurs that the forest animals reacted violently whenever the child was taken outside, scattering in frantic bursts or falling into sudden, eerie silence. As the child grew, even if only for a short time, its presence became something unspoken yet impossible to ignore. Some residents recall seeing the groom carrying the child into town once, wrapped so heavily in cloth that no skin was visible. They remember how he refused to speak to anyone, how tense his posture was, how he seemed to flinch at the slightest noise. And they remember the bride, still a near-mythical figure, standing at the tree line, watching with an expression no one could interpret. For some, it looked like anger. For others, sorrow. For a few, something far darker. What haunts the town most, however, is not the child's birth but its disappearance. One night, long before dawn, the couple's cabin windows glowed with a strange light seen by several neighbors, followed by a sound none of them could describe clearly. By morning, the child was gone. Some claimed the couple hid it. Others believed the forest claimed it. But the most unsettling accounts are from those who swear they heard a faint cry echoing through the woods for weeks afterward, long after any child should have survived. Centers on the discovery of the groom's final diary entry, an old, fragile page torn from a notebook that should have long since turned to dust. Its survival feels almost deliberate, as though someone wanted this particular truth to outlive everything else. The page surfaces unexpectedly when an amateur historian, researching the strange gaps in the town's past, buys a box of miscellaneous belongings at an estate sale. Most of the items are ordinary, rusted tools, brittle photographs, faded letters. But buried beneath them is a loose sheet of paper folded twice, its edges burnt, its ink smudged but still legible. The name at the top belongs unmistakably to the groom. The date matches the period after the forbidden marriage, long after the preacher vanished and well after the whispers about the unseen child had begun. What makes the entry so haunting is the tone, not tragic, not regretful, but terrified. The groom writes as though he is running out of time. His handwriting, once steady and bold, devolves into frantic, uneven strokes. He describes the days following the child's disappearance as something that tore apart his understanding of reality. He mentions hearing footsteps outside the cabin late at night, footsteps too light to be an adult's but too deliberate to belong to any animal. He writes about waking to find the door slightly open, though he knows he barred it himself, and seeing impressions in the dirt that looked like small hands pressed into the earth and dragged away. He admits he began sleeping with a lantern burning, terrified of the darkness that gathered in the corners of the room, darkness he swears shifted when he blinked. His words dart between fear for his own life and fear of what his wife had become during those final nights. The most disturbing section describes the bride's behavior. He writes that she no longer spoke to him in full sentences, only in short, clipped phrases that sounded rehearsed, as though she was reciting something she had heard rather than forming thoughts of her own. Her eyes, he notes, followed movements he could not see, and sometimes she stood motionless at the edge of the forest for hours, whispering in a language he didn't recognize. He claims she no longer slept. He claims she no longer ate. He claims she began calling their child's name each night, even though the forest had been silent since the storm. As the entry reaches its final lines, the handwriting becomes nearly illegible. The groom writes that he has realized the woman he married is not the woman he thought she was, and perhaps never had been. He expresses regret for the vows spoken under moonlight, regret for ignoring the warnings he once dismissed as superstition, and regret for bringing something into the world that should never have existed. The final sentence ends abruptly, as if the pen was ripped from his hand. All that follows is a smear of ink and a faint, reddish stain. Centers on the night the woods fell silent, a night etched into the memories of the oldest residents, even though few dare to recount it in detail. It happened not long after the groom's final diary entry, at a time when fear had already begun to settle over the town like a heavy fog. The forest that bordered the community had always been alive with sound, the steady hum of insects, the distant calls of owls, the rustle of small animals weaving through underbrush. But on that particular night, every natural noise seemed to vanish at once, as if the entire woodland drew in a single, trembling breath and refused to release it. People inside their homes reported waking suddenly, without knowing why, and realizing that the quiet outside was so complete it felt unnatural, suffocating, almost wrong. It was in this eerie stillness that the first scream echoed through the valley. Those who heard it insist it didn't sound entirely human. It was too layered, too distorted, as though it came from a throat unfamiliar with the shape of human words. Some residents swore it carried the sharp edge of a child's cry buried beneath something deeper. Others remain unconvinced, believing the sound to be something far older, something that did not belong to any living creature they recognized. Whatever it was, the scream rippled through the trees, bounced off the hills, and crawled beneath doors, settling into the chests of those who heard it. Panic spread quickly, even though no one knew exactly what had caused the sound. Within an hour, lanterns flickered on throughout the town as men gathered their rifles and ventured toward the woods in a hastily formed search party. Their dogs, usually eager to track scents through the forest, refused to move past the first row of trees, whining and pulling against their leashes. Several men reported feeling a coldness radiating from the forest's edge, a chill so deep it prickled their skin despite the warm season. Still, driven by duty or perhaps desperation, they stepped inside. The deeper they went, the more wrong everything felt. The air hung heavy and unmoving. Leaves didn't crunch underfoot. Even the lantern flames appeared dimmer, as if the forest was swallowing the light. The men searched for hours but found no signs of struggle, no bodies, no footprints, nothing to explain the scream. Yet many claimed they heard faint noises trailing behind them, rustling movements that stopped the moment they turned, soft breaths that seemed to come from nowhere. One man later swore he heard a whisper right at his ear, a voice that didn't belong to any person he knew, urging him to go back. When the search party finally retreated, shaken and exhausted, the woods remained silent until dawn. And when morning light finally broke through the trees, the forest seemed untouched, as though nothing had happened at all. But the townspeople knew better. They knew something had moved through those woods that night, something unseen, something searching. The scream was never explained, and no one ever agreed to enter the forest after dark again. focuses on the moment someone finally gathers the courage to return to the abandoned cabin, the place where the marriage certificate was found, where the forbidden union began, and where every whispered rumor seems to converge. It is not a decision made lightly. By the time this return happens, the townspeople have become so fearful of the forest that even stepping near its border feels like tempting fate. But an outsider, determined to uncover the truth behind the vanishing records, the missing child, and the groom's haunting diary entry, decides the only way to understand what really happened is to walk straight into the heart of the story. The townsfolk plead with him not to go. One old woman grabs his wrist with surprising strength and warns him that the cabin remembers things better than people do. Another man mutters that the place is never empty, no matter how abandoned it looks. But curiosity and a stubborn desire for answers win out. The path is even harder to follow now. What was once only overgrown now seems deliberately obstructed, as if the forest itself has tried to erase the trail. Branches hang low, twisting into unnatural shapes, and the air feels thick enough to slow every step. But the outsider continues, driven by a sense that the cabin holds something crucial, something left behind intentionally or carelessly. As he approaches the clearing, the world grows unnervingly still. Not silent like before, this quiet is different, watchful, as though the forest is waiting. The cabin looks even worse than the first descriptions, its roof sagging like a spine on the verge of breaking, its walls warped from time and dampness. Yet the door stands slightly open, as if inviting him in. Inside, the air is stale, coated with the scent of earth and charred wood. The faint light slipping through the gaps in the walls reveals a room left exactly as it had been after the groom disappeared. The overturned chair remains on its side. The lantern still sits on the table. Dust coats everything except for one unsettling detail: faint footprints on the floorboards, too small to be an adult's, leading toward the back of the cabin. The outsider feels a cold prickle crawl up his spine as he follows them. They stop abruptly near the wall where the marriage certificate once hung. The frame lies shattered on the floor, the certificate gone. In its place is a deep scratch carved into the wood, long and deliberate, as though made by fingernails dragged too hard. The scratch forms a single word or something that resembles one. The outsider leans closer, tracing the uneven edges, trying to decipher it. Before he can make sense of the marking, a faint sound cuts through the stale air. It's soft, distant, and impossibly familiar to anyone who knows the stories, the wail of a child echoing somewhere far beyond the cabin walls, rising and falling as if calling out. The outsider freezes, every muscle tightening. The sound is not human. It is too layered, too stretched, too full of an ancient ache that does not belong to anything living. As the cry fades, the temperature drops sharply. The outsider's breath clouds in front of him. And then he notices something else: the forest outside the door has gone completely silent again, just like that night long ago. The cry stops. The air holds its breath. And the outsider realizes that something in the woods has awakened to his presence, and it knows he has returned to the place where the story began. How the final remnants of these forgotten generations slipped quietly out of existence, leaving behind almost nothing that could speak for them. It reflects on how a community can disappear not through a single catastrophic moment, but through a long sequence of choices, silences, and circumstances that gradually erase every trace of its presence. In these remote pockets of society, where families had already been living with isolation, stigma, and internal collapse, the last members felt a growing pressure to distance themselves from the past rather than preserve it. Many chose to leave their ancestral homes behind, seeking anonymity in larger towns where no one would ask about their surname, lineage, or the whispered stories tied to them. Others, burdened by shame or the weight of generational trauma, destroyed photographs, letters, and any personal objects that connected them to the life they wanted to escape. Even the elders, who once held fragments of memory within their storytelling, reached a point where the narratives became too painful to repeat or too fragmented to make sense of, and so the histories that had survived for decades finally faded with them. The larger world, already unaware of their existence, never noticed the moment they disappeared. There were no official records marking their passing, no commemorations held to acknowledge the end of a lineage, and no researchers who had documented their experiences before they vanished. As time moved forward, the abandoned structures where they once lived were reclaimed by nature, collapsing under their own weight until even the outlines of their homes became indistinguishable from the landscape. On rare occasions when a wanderer might come across those remnants, the signs of human life were so faint that they seemed like shadows rather than real evidence of a family that had lived, struggled, and endured in that place. In the absence of preserved artifacts or documented testimonies, whatever truths existed about their lives transformed into speculation, myth, or were lost entirely. This disappearance highlights how vulnerable certain groups are when society chooses not to see them. It raises unsettling questions about how many communities across history may have dissolved in similar silence, leaving behind no proof of their identity or suffering. It also forces us to confront how fragile memory becomes when knowledge is not intentionally passed on or protected. In this case, it was not merely neglect but a deep desire from within the final survivors to let the story die, to avoid the burden of explaining what they came from or why their lineage had been shaped by isolation and hardship. Over time, the world moved on, new generations grew up, and the land reshaped itself, until the existence of that entire bloodline became something that lived only in faint traces of rumor and half-remembered local folklore, drifting further away with each passing year.